In this video we're going to talk about computer programming workflow. By workflow I mean that there are a certain number of steps that you'll take in every project that you go to create from now on. And there are certain things that have to go on during each of these steps, and so that's what we're going to highlight in this video. The first step in any process developing software is to plan what you're going to build. There's a planning phase, and that's basically determining what you're going to build and how you're going to build it, how you're going to test it, and how you're going to deploy it. As you begin to develop applications, it's very tempting to just jump right into the IDE and start coding. However, before long you're going to realize that this is not the best way to do it. There's actually a number of steps that you need to take in order to build good applications. So I'm going to paste some notes here instead of having you watch me type everything. In this case we're going to create a single window form that asks the user to input a bunch of values that we'll use then to calculate the compound interest. The next step in our plan is to, once we calculate what the interest is, what the end value is, we're going to display that result in a pop-up message box. Getting a little bit more detailed, we're also going to note here that our intent is to use the FV function in Visual Basic to actually do the calculation. So this defines what I'm going to build and a little bit about how I'm going to build it. The next thing I'm going to do is start thinking about how I'm going to test this application. I'm going to take some notes about things I can think of ahead of time that I need to make sure that the application does. For example, if somebody doesn't fill out all the information before trying to actually calculate the amount, our application should stop and tell the user that, look, you forgot some important information here. And I've listed some other items as well that we should remember while we're testing our application. But this is all part of our plan. Finally, I'm going to take some notes on how I'm going to deploy the application. This might include things about who I'm going to include on an initial beta. In this case, we'll send it to Jim and Steve and let them use the application for a little bit, and then once we do that, we'll make it available on our company's website. Of course, this is all fictitious. And these notes are very general, but you get the idea that the most important thing you can do when beginning a software project is to actually do something in the way of planning. Determine what you're going to be up against and how you're going to approach each of the risks that you'll encounter while you're programming. Now that I have my plan in place, it's time to move on to the next phase, which is the develop phase. And this is where we actually get to do the fun part, where we actually get to build the application using code and visual designers according to the plan. So what I've done is I brought up the visualstudio.net development environment. Again, I want to emphasize that it's not important exactly what I'm doing here. I want you to understand that what we're doing here is a way of illustrating following our plan and going through the development phase. So I'm going to move rather quickly. Don't be alarmed. We'll come back and explain all of these things in the future. I'm going to create a Windows application. And we're going to put it at I'll resize my window. I'm going to start placing some labels on the design surface. So we can fit that in. I'm going to pull it out a little bit. Place some text boxes here to capture information from our user. A couple of radio buttons. And another text box. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Just make sure I named them correctly. So I've resized my form to make it look pretty, saved everything I've done, and now I'm going to double click on the calculate button and I'm going to write some code that'll be executed whenever somebody clicks on my button. But rather than type everything, I'm just going to paste it from a previous try at this project that I've had. Please keep in mind that I typically type all this out, but it would take me a while, and it's probably boring enough watching me do this without a whole lot of commentary at this point. But I will do this, just so you can see. Okay, so I've pretty much gone through the entire development phase. I've created my GUI, my graphical user interface for my application. And then I've also written code that interacts with the user whenever they click on certain buttons within my application. So I've finished with principal development of the application, and now we're ready to go on to the next phase, which is the testing phase. Now there's a lot of different kinds of testing that you can do. You can do your own testing, which you must do whenever you're building applications. Test it yourself. Also, in some organizations that have a dedicated testing staff, there might be a whole team of quality assurance professionals that do in-depth testing and analysis on your application. However, for our purposes, we're going to keep it very simple. What we can do is actually run our application right now and try it out. So I'm going to click this Start button here. Shows that it built successfully, so we don't have any compilation errors. We'll explain what those are later. And now let's take a look at the plan that we've actually created. In the testing area, we want to make sure that all fields are filled out before trying to calculate the amount. So we're going to see if we remember to actually take that into account whenever we developed our application. And you can see that we get a message box from Visual Studio that says an unhandled exception of type system.format exception occurred. Input string was not in a correct format. What I can gather from this is that we did not do the check to make sure that information was filled out. And so our application failed our first test. So we would need to go back and actually fix the problem. But let's test the application one more time, and then we'll define what the testing phase actually is. Let's say we want to save $200 each month, and we expect the interest rate to be 2.45%. For how many months do we wish to save? 12 months. Yeah, we make payments at the end of the month. And how much is in savings right now? Let's say $2,000. And let's click our Calculate button. According to our calculator, our savings will be worth $4,476.69. So what we would want to do is either take out our own calculator and run the formula ourselves, or find some other application either on the internet or some financial calculator that would be able to help us determine if this is an accurate amount. So this leads us to what the testing phase actually is. This step involves testing the application's inputs and outputs to ensure that the application performs as planned. And whenever the application doesn't perform as planned, we need to fix those problems that are referred to as bugs within our program. Let's go ahead and click the cancel to quit our program. Let's go ahead and explain a little bit about what went on during the development phase before we get on to the last part of our discussion. If you recall, one of the first things that I did was went to File, New Project, and it popped open this New Project dialog. Whenever you create an application in Visual Basic, you can create different types of applications and select a different template. We'll talk about this more in video 4 in this series. Whenever we fill out the information, the name and the location where our project will be saved, you'll notice that we can see information about our project in this Solution Explorer window that's typically on the right-hand side. Here we see something called a solution, Lesson 02, and then there's another line underneath of it which says that there's a project, Lesson 02. Solutions and projects are a way of organizing source code. First of all, each solution can contain one or more projects. It's a way of organizing projects that are all somewhat interrelated to each other. By default, whenever you create a new project, there will be a solution that will contain that project, just in case you want to add more projects. And we'll show you why you'd want to add a project to this solution in just a moment. Then the next layer down is the project, and a project is a way of further organizing the code. Each project contains one or more files that are needed for the application in order for it to be compiled into an assembly, which is a file with a .dll or .exe extension that will be executed by the .NET runtime like we described in the first lesson in this series. As we look in our code, you can see that there's some blue letters, there's some black letters, and then there's some green letters. There's also kind of an aqua colored series of numbers off to the left hand side. The blue words are reserved words. They're keywords within Visual Basic, and they have special meaning. The black words are variables and procedure names, and we'll talk about what those are a little bit later. And then the green letters here are actually code comments, and code comments are statements that are typed into your code to explain or remind yourself and others what that code is actually doing. It's not actually compiled into the assembly when you make your program. You can actually type comments in English so that you can understand them. They're not interpreted or used in any way by .NET or the .NET compiler. As you're starting out, it's tempting to not use code comments, but I would give you this piece of advice that you should comment everything so that you can remind yourself of what you did and why you did it. When you actually go to become a professional programmer and get a job, your code will be judged on how many code comments and the quality of those comments. In other words, do they actually describe what's going on? Are they actually helpful? So we've taken a look at various pieces of the Visual Studio.NET IDE, such as the Solution Explorer. We've talked about what solutions are and what projects are, and we've also taken a look at the code window and talked about the different parts of the syntax, such as keywords, variables, and then also we've talked about code comments. As I was actually designing the interface for our project, you'll notice that I used this little toolbox which jettisons out from the left-hand side, and I was able to drag and drop things onto this designer area. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the fourth video. But let's move on. There's one final phase that we need to discuss, and that is the deployment phase. And deployment involves making the application ready to be distributed and ensure that the application is installed and ready for your users. And the way that you can do that is by adding another project to your solution, which actually creates an installation program. This is sometimes called a deployment project. To add a deployment project, I'm going to go to my File menu, Add Project, New Project. I'm going to select Setup and Deployment Projects, Set a Project, and call this Calculator Setup. And I'm going to make sure that it's in the correct directory. Then I'm going to click OK. And so now I have a second project. As you can see now, my solution contains two projects. The one project is the actual calculator program that we've created, and then the next one is the setup program. Now we can make a lot of modifications to the setup, but what we're going to do is just go ahead and build our entire solution. Actually, we'll build it using release. And then we'll build our solution. And let's go ahead and build our setup as well. And now let's bring up our Explorer and take a look in our calculator setup that we have a setup.exe. We're going to double click that, and now we have the calculator setup wizard. It asks me where I want to put this on my hard drive, and then proceeds to install it. And the installation is complete. Now I can run it a second time and notice the functionality that I get. I can repair or remove the calculator setup. Notice that I really didn't do a whole lot in order to get all this additional functionality. We can tweak this, and we would really need to if we were going to distribute this, because we'd want to make it look a little bit fancier. But ultimately, that is the deployment phase. Now we can release that to place on somebody else's computer or put it on our company's website. So again, just to recap, there are 4 phases within software development. There's the plan phase, where we actually decide what we're going to build. The develop phase, where we actually build what we planned on. The testing phase, where we see if we've accurately built what we set out to build. And then finally, the deployment phase, where we make the application ready to be installed on a target computer. You can see what we were able to do in just a few short minutes, how we were able to build an entire application. Make it look relatively good, write code to give it some meaning, and then actually test it and create an installation program for it, all in the course of maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. In the next video, you're going to see more about actually creating graphical user interfaces using the toolbox and some of the controls plus new controls that we'll introduce in that video. But don't forget to do lesson 3 first. It shows you how to get the tools that you'll need in order to create these applications. Thank you.